Hello and welcome to the Business as Usual podcast, which is part of the Edify podcast network. This podcast series is a 5-part look at exam technique for the Edexcel A-level business specification. In the 5 parts of this series, we're going to look at the exams as a whole, each individual type of question, and including some ideas for structure and model answers. My name is Jack Goodrich and my usual co-host is Mike Sawyer. We're both teachers in schools in the UK. This series is just me, but Mike's going to be doing a similar series for Edexcel GCSE specification students and teachers soon. Let's get started. Welcome to part 3 of this podcast series on exam technique. This one is going to be about 8-mark exam questions. So, as ever, I would advise that you've watched, especially the introduction one, which talks about the different types of exam technique and the way we structure our paragraphs before looking at this one. Just as a reminder, that introduction, so this podcast series is aimed at students of the Edexcel A-level in business. The podcast in general is aimed at students of all exam boards and GCSE and A-level, but because we teach Edexcel, our exam technique sessions tend to focus on that. In this series, this is part 3 of the 5 parts. The first part was about the exams and paragraph structure in the question and how the question looks. I would certainly advise that before you look at any of the other parts, which you can do in isolation, you need to have a look at that one first. Otherwise, some of the stuff we talk about isn't going to make much sense. We've done a 4-mark section already. This one's about 8 marks, and then shortly we're going to be doing one on 10 and 12-mark exam questions because there's a lot of similarities between those and then the 20-marker. It's going to be available on YouTube as a video and Spotify as a podcast. I would, as I've said before, I would recommend that you watch this as a video on YouTube because being able to see the presentation, especially when we come to model answers, is really, really useful. But it is available as a podcast in case it's something that you want to go back to at a later date. So let's think about the basics of an 8-marker. Now, 8 markers are quite prominent in the AS papers, but in A2 they only appear on paper 3. And effectively they just replace the 2 4 markers. So on that paper 3, instead of having 2 4 markers in each section, you have 1 8 marker. So it is quite tricky because it means that it makes the timing a little bit more difficult because you have to write an extra essay basically instead of doing 2 little 4-mark questions. But also the 8 marker is actually quite time intensive in terms of what it requires. They're assessed questions. The 10 and 12 markers are also assessed questions, but these ones are assessed 2, which we'll come to in a second. It says it's always going to ask you to assess 2 of something. And it could be a variety of types of assessment. It could be assess 2 factors, assess 2 reasons, assess 2 benefits, or anything like that. As I've just mentioned, questions look like assess 2, and it could be any of a number of things: benefits, factors, reasons, drawbacks, etc. So the example question that we're going to have a look at today is assess 2 benefits to Pure Gym for using inorganic growth when expanding. So that would be an 8 marker. So there we've got the prompt is that assess 2 benefits, the business is Pure Gym, and then the sort of key term of the question, the knowledge of the question, comes from inorganic growth when expanding. In terms of your structure, you don't need a definition and you don't need a conclusion, but you do need 2 each paragraphs, and in this case it's going to be 1 for each benefit. If it was 2 factors, you would need 1 for each factor, and you do need those howevers. The howevers don't need to be very long, but you do need a however to both of your points. Now, that can be quite confusing because even this question says assess 2 benefits. The word assess requires you to look at both sides of the argument. So even though the question specifically says benefits and doesn't say anything about drawbacks, you do need to put some limitations to your benefits or some drawbacks to your benefits in those answers, which is why you need to make sure that however in that peach paragraph is there. Otherwise, you're going to struggle to get those top marks. These are the levels of response from the exam board. So this is what's published in the mark schemes. And what you'll see here is you've got 3 levels of response. Level 1 gets you 1 or 2 marks. Level 2 gets you 3, 4 or 5 marks. Level 3 gets you 6, 7 or 8 marks. Now, a couple of years ago, I did this with my students. I got my students to rewrite those descriptors into phrases that made a little bit more sense for the paragraph structure that we use, which, as mentioned in the first part of this series, is a peach paragraph structure. And so this sort of shows a little bit of what you need to get certain mark bands. And obviously, I would imagine that everyone's going to be looking to get into level 3, and at the very minimum wants to be midway through level 2. So we'll look at level 2. You need to display knowledge in the points that you select. You need to have some consideration of the effect and the circumstances of the business. Some evidence of application as well. It needs to have that if you want to get any more than sort of 3 marks. But it might be quite unbalanced. You might have weak however points, you might not have any however points. The difference between that and the 6 to 8 marks is we're going to have good knowledge, we're going to have a detailed consideration of the effect and potentially some circumstances of the business. It's got to be consistently linked through application of the business using the extract, and it's going to be a balanced assessment. So just as an example, I want to show you that question that we've mentioned already, assess 2 benefits to Pure Gym for using inorganic growth when expanding. This is the example of a case study you might use. So Extract I talks about Pure Gym and about how they've acquired one of the fitness industry's well-known brands, LA Fitness. And effectively that is the example of inorganic growth. So if you'd like to have a go at this question, I've written one example answer for this, 1 paragraph example for this. Rather than do the full thing, there's no need for me to show you 2 full peach paragraphs. I've written 1. But if you want to have a go at it first, the key thing to remember when you're practicing these questions is to make sure you do them within the timed conditions. So in this, you want to try and do it as close to 8 minutes as you possibly can. Admittedly, I think there's a little bit of a disparity between the amount of minutes you get or the amount of marks you get for the length of time it takes you to write an 8 marker compared to maybe a 10 or 12 marker, because in some respects, the 8 marker can be just as long, if not longer. So you have to make sure you're really careful with your timing on this, which is why the more practice you can get, the better. So have a go, pause this podcast, pause this video, have a go at the question, and then once you're ready to have a look at a model paragraph, using the peach paragraph structure, move on to the next part, resume. So as I mentioned, I've only done one of the paragraphs as an example, and I'll just read through it and talk through sort of the points I've made and where I've made them and how they fit into that structure. So one benefit to Pure Gym of using inorganic growth when expanding is that it allows them to save costs when opening new gyms nationally. So that's my point. I've just made it really clear. I don't need to go into huge amounts of detail in that first sentence. I'm going to do that, but I just want to make my point really clear to the examiner so they can see that that's a fair point. That is something that it would do. It would allow them to save costs in some respects. And so then the examiner is going to be looking for me to expand on that and then to bring in something from the case study. So I'll continue. This should reduce fitting costs significantly as LA Fitness gyms will already be full of equipment. This saves Pure Gym money as they won't have to fit the gym out from scratch. If Pure Gym were to adopt an organic growth strategy, they'd be buying empty premises that would require large renovation. And then we can link this to the case study. It talks about how Pure Gym are a low-cost provider. So as Pure Gym operate with a low-cost provider strategy as their competitive advantage, any saving in cost allows them to set cheaper prices. So that is circumstantial as well, because we know that that's the position that Pure Gym are in within this market. We know that they're low cost, and as a result, the amount of money that they can save allows them to reduce their prices, which then allows them to obviously gain their competitive advantage. You don't need to explain necessarily all of that, but to explain to you why I've put that sentence in and how I'm aware of the context and the circumstances surrounding Pure Gym. We do need that, however, though. So that, however, doesn't need to be very long. It can just be sort of one sentence. So here we go with, however, the LA Fitness gyms may have facilities not required by Pure Gym that could be expensive to remove. It mentions saunas and swimming pools, so you could mention about how potentially they might be difficult to remove, and so as a result, this equipment might not be easily or cheaply replaceable. So you can sort of bring into your point there about how it's not necessarily ideal, and that's what you, however, needs to do. It just needs to provide counterbalance to the point that you just made. My point was that it allows them to save costs. Well, actually, there are some ways in which it might not, and so I don't have to write a conclusion or anything like that. I don't have to reach a final judgment about whether it does or not. I just have to provide the arguments. So hopefully that helps with the structure and the answering of an 8-mark question. Check back through the first 2 parts of this series and keep an eye out for parts 4 and 5 coming in the next few days. Cheers.